Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog.
Good evening, I'm Yvonne Stapp, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, we learn how the combination of industrial fishing, the international fishing trade, and climate change now threaten many developing nations that depend on local fish as their basic food source. Although the immediate effects are experienced by nations that are often not on the media radar, the long-range impact will be felt by the whole world. Our guest is ecologist and epidemiologist Christopher Golden. Dr. Golden is a research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and associate director of the Planetary Health Alliance at the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He's also an appointed emerging explorer for National Geographic Society. Dr. Golden's research is concerned with the effects of global environment on human health, and he's conducted studies in many developing nations where biodiversity declines now are threatening substantial populations. Chris Golden received his Ph.D. in environmental science, policy, and management at the University of California, Berkeley in 2011. And he brings to his field a broader and more global perspective that's still very new in the field of public health and environment. We're very pleased to welcome Chris Golden. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so delighted, first of all, that you're going to give us this background because we really do not get it through like the general media, so we are in much need of knowing what's going on here. Could you tell us about the background in terms of the part of the world that you are concerned with and the problems in general there?
Sure. The work that I'm doing now that focuses really on how global fish declines will have downstream effects on food security and human nutrition is global in nature. It arose from a long-term research program that I've been leading in Madagascar. So I've been working there for the past 17 years, and through my living there, seeing what day-to-day life and circumstances are, I became more and more fascinated by this subject area of how a rapidly and accelerating changing environment might have downstream effects on human nutrition and human health.
Yeah, that's a rather important area of concern.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah, and you've been working on it for a long while.
I have, and yet the fisheries work is quite new. I've just started working on this in the past 2 years.
I see.
And what we're doing is far more global in nature. So we're not just working in Madagascar, we're working in many other places around the world. We're working in places like the Solomon Islands, Bangladesh, British Columbia, so a place even a bit closer to home. Right. In several other places, we're planning on future research as well.
You've written a good bit about the importance of fish for nutrition. Can you give us some information about that in these impoverished areas? What is happening? Why is fish so important?
Sure. So I guess at the broadest level, the importance of animal source foods, so fish and other types of meats, to human nutrition has nothing to do with protein. Most people hear meats and they think of it as synonymous with protein.
Exactly.
You can get everything that you need in your diet in terms of protein from a vegetarian diet.
Okay.
The reason why animal source foods are important are that they deliver things like iron, zinc, vitamin B12, vitamin A, fatty acids, certain types of nutrition that are either in low levels within vegetarian diets or are absent completely.
Okay.
And so for those reasons, it's really critical that you will have some form of animal source foods in your diet. And so if you think of a context like the US, we can compensate for what animal source foods give you by having supplements or vitamins,
I see,
by
yes.
having fortified or biofortified foods, by eating things like Special K where they pack in everything
Yeah,
into a
right,
packaged
right,
product. We also don't face the same types of infectious disease that leaches nutrition out of your body like many other people around the world are.
Right.
And so in places along the kind of tropical belt or in developing countries where they don't have market access to different forms of food within their diet, where they don't have vitamins and supplements and they're not having biofortified or fortified foods, they really rely on animal source foods to deliver those types of nutrients, which we call micronutrients, into their diet.
That's really important information. I don't think I've ever come across that until I was reading your material. And you just alluded to this problem of deficiencies that people get under these conditions in poor nations, presumably where the diet is somewhat limited. And we know nothing about this. Could you tell us about some of those deficiencies that people do get?
Sure. So I think a main one is iron deficiency. Iron deficiency anemia affects more than 1 billion people around the world.
Wow.
So people within the US are affected by this, and even people who are obese, who we would consider overnourished, are still not getting the proper types of nutrition, and so could actually still be anemic. In a place like Madagascar, where I work extensively, pre-adolescent children, or children 12 and under, actually around 60% of that population is affected by anemia. And so a really massive global health burden of disease is really directed at micronutrient deficiencies.
Right. Does it affect their cognitive ability, their ability to work as they are older?
Absolutely. So if you think about something like anemia, this is usually measured as the number of grams per deciliter of hemoglobin in your blood. And so this is all driven and produced. Hemoglobin is created by having enough iron inside of your red blood cells. What happens is if you have an average adult man will have kind of between 12 to 17 grams of hemoglobin per deciliter. And if you lose 1 gram per deciliter, so about 10%, which really isn't much, if you lose 1 gram per deciliter of hemoglobin, that increases the chances of perinatal mortality by 25%. It increases the rates of maternal mortality by 25%. There are massive impacts on cognitive development, which they've shown are not reversible, so they will last 20 years into the future. And so much of the nutrition that you derive kind of in the womb and also in the first few years of life are really critical in determining your trajectory for proper health.
Whoa, that's very substantial. The other thing that you have discussed is, I think, things like, well, there's one instance of a nutritional deficiency, and it's much less familiar to us anymore in developed nations because, as you say, we have supplemental forms. Or the other is that parasites are apparently a big problem when you don't have decent nutrition. Is that true?
Absolutely. There's kind of 2 different forms of infectious disease that I think play a very large part in also determining nutritional status. And these are things that are very common and prevalent within the kind of tropical and developing world. And so one of those is malaria, a type of infectious disease that actually can leach iron out of your blood. And those severe attacks really have an important impact on your nutritional status. And the other is intestinal parasites. So because many of these developing nations lack proper infrastructure to maintain adequate hygiene and sanitation, the prevalence of those intestinal parasites are much higher in these populations, and that also can inhibit absorption of nutrition and also leach nutrients out of your bloodstream.
Okay, and then you mentioned things like zinc, things that you get in very small amounts, but they happen to be critical. Do those have long-range effects too if your diet is deficient in terms of cognitive and just general health development?
Sure, this is a bit outside of my area of expertise, but what I will tell you is that zinc is incredibly important for your overall health. So they've shown that zinc deficient children are far more likely to get diarrheal disease and far more likely to die of diarrheal disease. And so in terms of maintaining and supporting overall immunity and immune function,
Yeah.
zinc is really one of the most critical micronutrients.
Okay, and I take it that a lot of these, we'll go back to the map in a minute, but that a lot of these people live on like coastal areas, so you don't have an alternative like big farms, or even for that matter much small farms, but you're at risk more. Is that the idea? So fish are very important for many of these people. And so what are the things that have depleted the fish now? So I'm taking it that for a very long time, for generations, most of the time people had adequate fish, but not now, as we understand what's happening.
Let me first answer your first point. So what you're seeing in the developing world, and particularly the developing world in the tropics, is that people are heavily reliant on natural resources for foods. And this is primarily because the market may have limited options for them to deliver animal source foods, and also they are prohibitively expensive. And so many people who are living in the developing world and very much working in order to provide food for their family and put food on the table don't have the excess cash
Of course.
to buy these more luxury items like meats.
Right.
And so that financial and economic aspect is a really important dimension to understand, because it reinforces existing inequalities, where people who do not have access to these natural resources that we'll talk about do not have the ability to substitute that missing part of their diet with items from the market. And so they are not accessing that, which makes them less and less healthy, which makes them less and less able to work and make money, which then provides less food on the table. And so there's a reinforcing cycle of creating and almost exacerbating these types of inequalities.
Exactly, it's very important. Thank you for bringing that up. And then, so we have some limitations there anyway, but under the best circumstances, at least the fish would be abundant and fish are nutritious. But things have changed, evidently. So what's happening?
So the point there was really to say that something that you can access freely are these natural resources. So things that you can harvest from the forest, from savannas, from the ocean, are things that don't require, on occasion, a significant amount of capital input to access them. And so if you can freely access fish because you have a robust fishery, that then provides almost a free delivery of certain types of meats and nutrition. And what is now facing these people in the developing world in terms of threats to their fisheries is coming, I guess, from three different directions in very, very broad categories. And one is unsustainable fishing, where local people are either self-depleting their own nutritional resource through improper use of certain types of technologies. And another form of unsustainable fishing would be industrial fishing that is done improperly, that can either damage the ecosystem and the ecological web, and thus kind of create reductions in fish supply for local people. The other is climate change, which is a really massively important topic here, which we see kind of moving fisheries poleward as the ocean becomes more and more warm along the tropics, as it becomes more and more acidic along the tropics. Fish will tend to migrate to their respective poles in order to avoid this kind of changing environment around them. And so what we tend to see is that as fish leave this tropical belt and move further and further toward the poles, it exposes this tropical belt of nations. And so you can see in the dark blue, that is where we anticipate fish declines to be the most significant. And the countries in orange are countries that are most reliant on fish and also exist at a threshold that's very close to deficiency or deficient. And so the combination and kind of overlap of the two of those things to say that a place is vulnerable and its people are vulnerable to malnutrition, and also to say that they are having escaping resources where fish are going to become in fewer and fewer supply, that is translating into this perfect storm that will make them lose access to their natural resources and then also not have proper nutrition.
Yeah. Could you tell us, in case people can't see the names of the countries too well, but just in general, I see the west coast of Africa there, and down, okay.
So Central and Western Africa is anticipated to feel this the most, in addition to many parts of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And so places like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Cambodia and Myanmar, those places are really expected to feel that in Southeast Asia. Similarly, in places like Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, all of these places are really expecting to feel this as well. And this is ignoring a lot of the industrial fishing dynamics. So in a place like Ghana and West Africa, they really face a lot of pressure from European fleets coming in and using their industrial fishing fleets to poach, or in some cases legally acquire fish, but then that takes the resources away from local people from having access to those resources.
How far in these huge ships, I don't know if people have seen them or not, but they're massive. How far in do they go? How much do they intrude?
It really depends on what type of seafood they're targeting.
Okay.
And so, for instance, with tuna fisheries, these industrial fishing fleets will be in the high seas.
Yes.
And so in terms of actually damaging the ecosystem, probably not much risk unless they went into closer coastal waters. In terms of severely depleting the tuna supply, absolutely. But when you deal with certain types of industrial fishing fleets like shrimp trawlers that go to the coast and can tear up coral reefs and can really damage that coastal environment, that then has a huge impact on local coastal populations of people in the developing world being able to access and manage their own resources.
Right. Well, not only that, I guess it destroys whole environments, whole ecosystems, I should say, correct? So a whole lot of fish species or shellfish or whatever. So a lot of people, this is a lot of people, correct?
Absolutely.
Millions and millions of people are very vulnerable and have no alternative. Is that the idea?
We estimated that between 800 million and 1.4 billion people could face a new nutritional deficiency.
And you're talking about
based on our expectations of fish declines between now and 2050.
Are these areas subject to any of the problems associated with climate change, like storms, for example, and surges that are so destructive as well? Are there things about the climate change that are?
Absolutely. So there are places within the South Pacific that we are considering working that have massive issues around cyclones.
Yeah.
That when cyclones come,
bigger.
This is really, really damaging to their local coastal environments. It has a huge impact on the types of fish that are available, and more so in combination with other aspects of climate change. So coral bleaching, for example, they've anticipated that 50% of coral reefs will disappear within the next 30 years. Coral reefs, in addition to being the homes for fish,
major homes,
are also serving a regulatory function for nations where it really buffers them against storm surge coming in. And so by losing the coral reef, you're not only losing the fish inside of it, but you're also losing that kind of protective wall that protected you from this storm surge. And so there's a multitude of different types of these climate impacts that will be felt in certain nations, like within the South Pacific.
Right. And then I assume that also this erodes a lot of the shoreline as well in
through
many
sea
of
level
these
rise.
areas. So that's an additional thing. There's one more thing here. So climate change is a big factor, but the climate change and industrial fishing together must be...
The synergies between the two are massive.
There is another factor that you mentioned, and that is the trade in fishing. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So fish and seafood broadly is one of the most, if not the most, globalized commodity on Earth.
Oh, I know that.
So in terms of where fish is caught and captured and the network of markets that it has to pass through before it lands on our dinner plates is truly extensive. And so what we need to understand is that many of the seafood items that we might be eating are coming from potentially the waters of distant countries where those types of fish could be critically important forms of nutrition to local people.
Yeah.
And so many of the industrial fishing fleets, especially in weak governance states,
Yeah, and there are many.
will harvest this type of industrial fish and then only export to industrialized nations or to kind of mega cities within the developing world.
So
And
from
so
the
it is
very
not
poor to the very rich.
exactly, and so it might not necessarily be directed at the types of people who need it most. And so if there isn't kind of the proper protocols and social responsibility over kind of bringing discards to local populations or making sure that a portion of the money that is generated through that market is then delivered to local people, they really face this kind of nutritional dilemma.
They are kind of forced to give up their produce, so to speak, to wealthy nations, and they are left with nothing.
I wouldn't go as far as saying forced. I think unfortunately it's a bit more complicated than that.
Oh, I see.
Where
Right.
the nations themselves will actually sell leases to foreign governments from the EU or
Right.
Japan, China, etc.,
Right.
to be able to fish within their waters. The
Okay.
problem is that the benefits from selling those leases goes to the government and is not necessarily distributed to the people who then
yes.
bear the burden of those
Yes.
decisions.
Right.
And the other thing is where aquaculture is developed. And so aquaculture as a technological innovation to compensate for these reductions in fish supply could be something that truly benefits the poor and the nutritionally vulnerable in the developing world. But unfortunately, the mass production of aquaculture is really being directed again at these mega cities within developing countries or to industrialized nations. And so there isn't really this kind of nutrition sensitive policies
Exactly.
around how to distribute this production in both wild capture fisheries and farmed fish.
Right. Does that have anything to do with the what should I say, the quality of the government in many of these places, that they too are very weak?
I think in many cases, yes.
Okay, because it's hard enough in developed nations to have good rules. We're not in control of industrial fishing yet, as far as I know, either. Okay, so we have really high populations, large populations that are extremely vulnerable, and there is a general loss of biodiversity. Everything is being affected in here. Are there any solutions at hand? What would you say?
So I think that there are two primary solutions that I would focus our efforts on, or three probably solutions that I would focus our efforts on. One is that global wild capture fish supply is in rapid decline. And so most estimates say, or the most recent estimates say, that in 1996, wild capture fish catch peaked. And since 1996, it's been declining by 1.2 million metric tons per year.
Oh my.
And so we need to reform
Fast.
how we're regulating fish catch and fish supply across the globe. And so I think that improvements within how we manage fisheries, how we are stewards of these natural resources, needs to be a primary thing that we are really focused on right now.
Is that like an international, you need an international directive, not just a
You do, but
local,
fortunately
regional-
there is that sort of setup within fisheries to be able to address some of these concerns.
Oh,
so
okay.
the policy infrastructure exists, convincing the stakeholders and governments to go with policies that will benefit the poor and the nutritionally vulnerable is where we need to go, but unfortunately are not there yet.
May I ask quickly before you go to those other couple of points that this is affecting everybody to have this depletion in the fish. We've had the famous story of the cod
Sure.
here, you know, in New England, and it was supposed to last forever, for heaven's sake. Salmon was supposed to be forever, no problems, but these are populations of fish that have been sorely depleted as well. And so you say there needs to be regulation, there are sort of policy structures, but nobody really pays attention to them. How do people weasel out of this?
I think that people pay attention, but I think unfortunately, as I mentioned before, where fish and seafood is one of the most commodified global
Yeah,
items
yeah.
on Earth, there's huge economic stakes. And so to convince governments not to sell leases for foreign fishing fleets to come or for illegal fishing not to take place, there needs to be monitoring systems. There needs to be engagement with these weak governance states. There needs to be social responsibility and ecological responsibility from a developed nation perspective. And none of those things are quite happening perfectly right
It
now.
acts a lot like climate, sounds a lot like the climate change thing. We'll all have a million meetings and
Yeah.
nothing much happens as a result of that. And so you have governments dragging their feet and so on. Okay, so you talked about some other aspects of solutions.
The two other types of solutions is in compensation for the wild capture fish declines. A truly promising development was this innovation with aquaculture of farming fish. And I think for the first time in human history, last year, people consumed more farmed fish than wild capture fish, which is astonishing. Nobody expected 10 years ago for farming fish to take off as much as it has. And so I think that that is incredibly promising. The technology around it is very sophisticated and can be done properly. What we need to do now is, again, on a more policy level, create nutrition-sensitive policies around aquaculture where it is distributed and able to flow to markets that will support the poor and nutritionally vulnerable.
Let me ask you something about that. There's been a bit of a fracas around, say, farmed salmon. And maybe it's not done correctly, so I'm sort of asking you that. So, okay, this was going to be a solution because we've messed up the salmon runs so badly. But there has been criticism that the salmon are too crowded, perhaps, that they're getting the wrong type of food. They are now subject to parasites that they didn't have a problem with before. And then there is a question of whether nutritionally it is as good as the wild form. I am asking you all of the above.
I think that the evidence in terms of nutritional equality between wild versus farmed is still out for decision.
Okay.
I think that there is some limited evidence that shows that wild capture salmon, for instance, is a better nutritional resource than farmed salmon. But again, I think this is heavily dependent on how it is farmed, and I think that it could get there with appropriate technology.
All right.
So I don't want to sound pessimistic that we can't get there. I
Right.
just think that there are some hiccups right now.
Okay.
I think that also it really depends on the environment of the farming, and so people are also concerned about the state of our wild oceans.
Yes.
So in terms of contaminants, mercury,
Yes,
etc.,
yes.
these are things that are not isolated to farming conditions. These are
Yes.
things that are everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to simultaneously clean up both systems and produce a healthier food supply in both systems.
Okay, so that's an important thing that you bring up. I hope people are aware we have many problems with polluting the oceans. Hard to believe that we have done such
Absolutely.
a job in basically a generation or so. These huge the plastic is affecting fish and wildlife in the ocean and so on, but all these contaminants that
Sure.
you mentioned as well. But basically you think it could be done. You could have farmed fish to provide adequate supplies if you did it right.
I don't think that that will ever be a silver bullet to
Of
solve
course.
everything.
Of course.
But I think that in combination with stewardship of the wild resources could serve as an effective solution. And so that brings me to my last point of
Yes.
intervention, which would be the creation of marine conservation areas, marine protected areas, and the development of improvements in fisheries regulations. And so all of these are really key, and this really goes back to my main body of work, which is trying to create synergies and co-benefits between environmental conservation and human health. And I think that this is such a great example of how we can combine the two of them. And so really the theory of change here is that if we create a marine protected area that has some sort of regulation around what can be caught, when it can be caught, how much of it can be caught, it could rehabilitate the local fish stocks. There might at the beginning have a shock to the system where people are not able to access enough resources, but over time, the rebounding and rehabilitation of that fish stock could then serve as a sustainable delivery mechanism for nutrition.
I see.
And so I think that that is a really beautiful prospect of simultaneously protecting biodiversity, of maintaining adequate fish stocks, but also creating the sustainable delivery mechanism of nutrition.
Are there any examples of these conservation areas that's familiar on land, of course, and they have brought back successfully some of the populations that were very much depleted, but are there fish examples?
The place that is nearest and dearest to my heart, Madagascar. The president announced about 2 years ago that he would triple the area of marine protected areas in the country. And so there are already great examples of where that has been happening effectively within Madagascar and really throughout most coastal nations on Earth. But they are doing it in two different forms. One is more a marine national park, where it's truly off limits and a no-take zones. And then there are examples where they have devolved the power of management to local communities. And there's many names for that in different places, but in Madagascar they call them locally managed marine areas, or LMMA. And there what happens is that the community takes over quote-unquote ownership over their coastal area. And with that devolution of rights, they then take pride in their own resources and taking care of them and sustain them in a better way, because it truly benefits themselves, because they're not kind of shipping off their resources to other people.
Exactly. That sounds very promising. That's something that makes citizens of people, doesn't it? But to have the community in charge making these decisions with something that directly benefits them is very interesting.
I think when done properly, it is as beautiful as you say it is. I think the problem is that it's always more complex than it appears to be. And so many local people believe that they already were the owners of these resources, and why is the government in a position to give them ownership over something that is already theirs? And so there are complexities within this, but I do believe that it truly is a way forward and a way that we could really benefit simultaneously the environment and human health.
This business where there's so much happening to vulnerable populations around the world all at the same time, very complex kinds of things affecting their nutritional base, then do you think, though, it can be stabilized? That sounds like your message, and you have tons of experience. So do you think that it is possible to bring stability back?
I do, absolutely. I think that there is certainly hope, particularly with this case of looking at fisheries. They have shown in many places around the world, there was a beautiful meta-analysis done of many, many different examples of marine conservation areas around the world, and they showed that if you protect these types of areas in the way that I just described, over the course of 5 to 10 to maybe 15 years, those fisheries can rebound. And that might seem like a long time scale, but it really is quite fast.
Short.
It's really quite fast. And so when you think about that, it really could be this important way and a very hopeful way of acting.
And also I thought you were going to say maybe a whole generation or something, but fish do breed fast. So if people could think in terms of 10, 15 years, things will be much better than they are now.
If we put the policies in place to allow these things to happen.
Do you have any suggestions about how to implement, how do you get governments to act?
One of the main reasons why I'm doing this project is to get governments to act, to get these multilateral organizations to act. Because I think a very compelling way to get people to care about human well-being and the environment is to pair the two together. Because the folks who don't really care about the biodiversity argument might care about the poverty, human well-being, and human health argument, and vice versa.
Well, there's another interesting thing here is that we all have a responsibility. These are people that could be, we're seeing this all the time, people really under terrible stress, and it's something that could be avoided, so we sort of have a responsibility. I hope that you get the message across. We're in dire need of this, and I hope that people will be motivated to help in some way. I don't know what we can do directly, but we need to be well informed in the first place. Dr. Golden, thank you very much, and I'm hoping that you'll come back and tell us about the bushmeat issue as well that you have worked on. I think it's Madagascar especially,
Exactly, yeah.
but it's another interesting area that we really have very little information on. But thank you very much for the fish story. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.